Our next speaker is Katrin Kogman-Appel. Professor Kogman-Appel holds the Evelyn Metz Memorial Research Chair at the Department of the Arts, Ben-Gurion University of the Negev Sheva. She is currently here in the States, though, visiting the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She received her PhD in 1994 from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's published widely on the relationship between Jewish and Christian art in late antiquity and on Hebrew manuscript painting. You will see her works in journals such as Geste, the Zeitschrift für Kunstgeschichte, the Art Bulletin, Speculum, and others. She is the author of a German book on 15th century haggadot from Germany, published in 1999, of Jewish book art between Islam and Christianity, which appeared in 2004, and of illuminated haggadot from medieval Spain, which was published in 2007 and won the Premio del Rey Prize of the American Historical Association in 2009. She's currently working on a book about the cultural and social background of the Leipzig Mazor. And her talk today is Joel Ben Simeon, illustrating the Washington Haggadah. Professor Kogman-Appel.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this lovely introduction and for putting up the Washington Haggadah, which I have not seen yet today, but I certainly will after we are finished here. So let's start. Here we go. In my heart counsels how to reply to him who asks and says, "Who painted these pages?" I shall answer him, "I am he, Feibush, called Joel, for Jacob Mattathiah, may he live long, a pious man." This colophon, found in the so-called London Haggadah, copied by Meir Yaffe, a scribe from Ulm in circa 1460, for a patron, Jacob Mattathiah, from the same town. Unlike most medieval colophons, it defines Joel Ben Simeon not as a scribe, but an illustrator. Medieval artists or illustrators hardly ever did sign their works. And here we have this man with a clearly defined professional identity. In fact, Joel Ben Simeon must have been an all-rounder of late medieval and early modern book trade. As we have learned already, he must have been born around 1420 in Cologne and may have received training as a scribe in the Rhineland. He reached Italy around the middle of the century, and there he seems to have received some artistic training as well, as from now on his style became quite Italianate. In fact, for all his career, he would use a drawing style that was quite common in Italian book illustration throughout the 15th century. While still in the Rhineland, he produced two manuscripts still extant. One is the so-called first Nuremberg Haggadah, his scribal style being quite professional. His drawings are a bit crude at that stage. They are, however, clearly embedded in a typical German tradition of illustration. The so-called spared ground technique, for example, the white or the parchment-colored figures against the ink background are very typical for German illustration, and we find them all over, especially southern Germany, throughout the 15th century. Also, these manuscripts, of which the first Nuremberg Haggadah is one of them, have abundant marginal illustrations, which were originally found in that manuscript, but unfortunately have been very badly trimmed, and thus our knowledge of this part of the graphic work is quite limited. The practice of unframed marginal illustration, however, was very common in Christian German book illustration of the time. In 1452 at the latest, Joel can be traced in Italy signing a Mahzor in Cremona. By then he was a young professional who, as many of his Ashkenazi co-religionists, had decided to try his luck further to the south, to cross the Alps and to settle in Italy. For a young Jew who had grown up in the German lands, Facing the threat of persecution and expulsion, northern Italy seemed like the perfect alternative. In contrast to Central Europe, where Jews were often expelled or suffered constant harassment, violent persecution, and forced baptism, early modern Italian culture facilitated acculturation and cultural exchange. Only a few of Joel's Italian colophons mention places, and it is quite clear that he did not settle anywhere for long, but rather continued to move, seeking work in various locations. Around the same time, he may have been involved also, in some way or the other, in the making of at least 4 Passover haggadot. And it is in these books that he would establish and develop a rich repertoire of Haggadah illustration that would prove to be the foundation of this genre for the generations to come. As Professor Stern has mentioned already, he would return at least twice to Germany, around 1460, when he participated in the production of the mentioned London Haggadah, and in 1478, when he wrote and illustrated the Washington Haggadah. The Washington Haggadah thus reflects Joel's work at the peak of his career. By the time he signed it, he was a mature scribe and artist who had traveled between the cultures. In his migrations between the 2 regions, Joel was, in a sense, an agent of cultural exchange, importing elements of Ashkenazi Haggadah illustration into Italy and taking back stylistic devices acquired in the region south of the Alps. Let us take a closer look at the imagery of the Washington Haggadah as a representative of Joel's repertoire. The text on each page leaves ample margins for the drawings. Originally, these margins were still broader. They were trimmed during the later rebinding. However, that trimming hardly affected the illustrations. They are more or less complete. In the corners, we can sometimes see that the color faded, as the book must have been extensively used. Let us take a very short look at these images, and I won't follow them here page by page. I'd rather prefer to look at them arranged in thematic groups. The series of marginal illustrations begin with 2 images that depict the search for leaven and the burning of the final leftovers of leaven found in the house. On the left, a man is scrutinizing a cupboard, while on the right, a youth is using a pair of bellows to steer a fire. Several other images follow a similar approach. A man pouring wine illustrates the text. In what way is this night different from all other nights? 2 women and a man are busying themselves with the preparation of the meal as an illustration to the Dayenu prayer, as a reminder that the time has now come to get the meal ready. A somewhat grotesque monkey seated on a red cushion holds the matzah. And on the following page, an apparently unhappy couple represents the maror, the bitter herbs, by extension, the bitter life of Egypt. A luxuriously dressed man raises a cup and illustrates the text. Therefore, we are obligated to thank, acclaim, and praise. As in all other haggadot associated with Joel Ben Simeon, the questions of the 4 men are illustrated by 4 figures, each representing a certain social type. The wise son, up here, is shown as a seated scholar with an open book. The wicked son as a knight, a Gentile, as a matter of fact. The simple son is shown as a man, as a humble man, in a somewhat worn-out cloak, seated on the floor. And the 4th man, the one who does not know how to ask, appears as a jester. I shall come back to these figures towards the end of my talk. This elaborate composition, illustrating pour out your fury on the nations that do not know you, we have already met before. And I would just like to add a further note on it. Joel left a particular large margin at the base of this page to allow sufficient space for an image. It shows the castle-like structure on the left with a youth peeking through the door and inviting Elijah, or the Messiah, who, riding on a donkey, approaches from the right. He is accompanied by an entire family seated behind him on the donkey's rear. The figure on the donkey is accompanied by followers, and one even just at the very end, I don't know if you can see it, catching or grasping to the tail. The mentioned 16th century text by Margarita, who was a baptized Jew, reports a Jewish folk belief about the coming of the Messiah. Now, Margarita had taken, as a baptized apostate, he had taken an anti-Jewish position, so we have his source as the only written source for this folkloric kind of motive, and we don't have the original Jewish version, so we have to look through his eyes to understand what he's meaning to tell us. And I'm quoting Margarita. According to the lies of the Jews, when the Messiah comes, he will ride upon an ass and seat all the Jews upon the ass, while all the Christians will sit on the ass's tail. Then the Messiah will ride with all his passengers into the sea, and when he comes to the depth of the sea, the donkey will drop its tail, and all the Christians will fall into the sea and drown. And indeed, this will have to be a very big ass. But even a bigger ass is a person who believes such things. Unquote. So we have to filter out the anti-Jewish remarks here in order to get to the original motive, which is quite folkloristic and no text of it exists. One scholar suggested that the last person in the Washington Haggadah on the right, trying to hold on to the tail, is a Christian maidservant. Now, the last image of this series shows, here's the person. That might be a Christian maidservant. The last image of this series shows Daniel in the lion's den as an illustration to the poem, Daniel performed many miracles at night, or rather specifically the sentence in the poem, the one who was saved from the lion's den souls the frights of night. Since its early days in the German lands, Ben Simeon took a fancy in verbal puns, expressions from the text translated literally into visual language. A typical example appears here near the text, "Go forth and learn what Laban, the Aramean, thought to do to our ancestor Jacob." The marginal illustration shows a man in medieval traveling gear and some luggage. Emphasizing the act of going forth, he moves forward energetically on a small piece of green land. The text, or part of the text of the Hallel, reads, "In distress I call on God." The word distress, matzor, can also be understood as siege, and the verse would read, "From the siege I call on God." Joel drew a walled town with a large tower, in whose window the face of an imprisoned man, apparently David, the author of the psalm, can be discerned. So here we find this little portrait here. Another theme that Joel depicted occasionally, and which, however, for some reason is not included in the Washington Haggadah, is an elaborate composition of the thematic high point of the Haggadah, the crossing of the Red Sea. This example is taken from the London Haggadah, and it spreads the scene over a double page. On the right-hand page, a massed Egyptian army approaches, and on the left, Moses follows the column of fire, leading the Israelites safely through the waters. What is interesting in this composition is not only its rich iconography, but also, and most importantly, the spatial representation of the two crowds of people reaching relatively deep into the picture space. Here we have really a crowd of an army, and we see the parts of it really very small and perspectively drawn. Early Ashkenazic work had known nothing of the kind. Old Testament illustration has a long tradition in Italy, reaching back to the early Christian period when the churches of Rome were decorated with elaborate narrative cycles of the history of the Israelites. The crossing of the Red Sea figures prominently in this tradition. Let us take just a short look at Cosimo Rosselli's composition of the Red Sea scenario in the Sistine Chapel from circa 1480. It postdates Joel's work, but it gives us a sense of how a 15th century Italian artist would have approached the subject. Although in the details of his figure style, Joel never fully acquired early modern Italian perspective and three-dimensional articulation, the organization of the picture space here is certainly indebted to Italian art to a quite high degree. The particular example of the London Haggadah was done for a patron in Southern Germany. And it seems that in the years to come, Joel's model was quite influential and find attempts at similar compositions also in haggadot, produced locally in Franconia, for example. And this is in Southern German, apparently from Franconia, Haggadah now in the Israel Museum, that really attempts to create a similar composition. However, here the graphic idiom is much flatter and less perspectively drawn. Joel Ben Simeon was a skilled maker of books. Most of the books he left are haggadot, and it seems indeed that he specialized in that genre. In the haggadot associated with him, we encounter a rich and rather original repertoire, which would become quite common in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. But apart from developing that repertoire, Joel introduced a further element into his illustrations. They are not merely a visual guideline to follow the Haggadah text. They are, as a matter of fact, a lively mirror of society, as Joel indeed had a very keen and curious eye, who looked very sharply at his surroundings. His observation of people cuts through several social strata, and in what follows we shall take a closer look of how he viewed some of the representatives of the communities he encountered. Commissioning an illuminated manuscript in the Middle Ages was a costly affair. We can easily imagine that the owners of the haggadot, and here we have an example from the London Haggadah and one from the Washington Haggadah. So we can easily imagine that the owners of the haggadot are meant to be represented in some of the drawings and paintings on the margins of Joel's haggadot. I should add here that this may have or was apparently overpainted by a later German painter by the name of Johannes Bähmler, but the iconography would still be very representative of Joel's own work. Now these patrons, these portraits, show men holding wine cups, the matzah, the maror, and so on. A prayer book from 14, and excuse me the poor quality of these images, but I couldn't find any better. A prayer book from 1469 was commissioned in Italy by such a patron, who intended it for the use of his daughter, the young lady Maravilla, and Joel Ben Simeon is the scribe of this manuscript. This not only opens up a lot of questions about women using prayer books, but the fact that the person holding the matzah in this image here shows indeed a young lady, confirms that such figures were meant indeed to represent the patrons and their families. The image that accompanies the halachma initial in the so-called Rothschild Haggadah, one of Joel's early Italian haggadot, now in Jerusalem, although badly preserved, still offers a close look at a large family seated at a table, lavishly set with golden dishes. All the peoples are well dressed, and the luxurious garment of the woman in the center clearly stands out. It's a quite lavish set table here. Joel represented these patrons time and again on the pages of his haggadot. Some of his patrons are known by name, others are not, and it has been suggested that the books were produced to be offered to occasional buyers, and we already heard about that. These portraits thus defined a social type rather than specific people, and sketched a particular social circle of Joel's clientele. Different from the wealthy patrons appear the scholars. Numerous scholars are shown on the margins of Joel's manuscripts. This is a common feature in both of the Sephardic and Ashkenazi tradition of Haggadah illustration. They represent the Mishnaic rabbis mentioned in the Haggadah text, the 5 rabbis of Bnei Brak, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Gamliel. Or also, as in this case here, the wise son. These men are usually shown as elderly figures, often with white, long, or gray hair and a beard. Since the second half of the 14th century, they usually appear with their heads covered. Joel adopts these figures in all their variations, and we find numerous scholars in all his haggadot. They appear either standing or seated, and always with a book in their hands. The book, the typical attribute of the scholar, can be shown often open, often on a lectern, or closed in the man's hands, or as here, that you can see the lectern. It's not on his lap, but he has a little lectern near him. So in this case, this iconography designates the first son, the first of the 4 sons. The medieval haggadot, each son is characteristic of a particular social type. The wise son is often shown as an elderly man with these attributes of a rabbi. It is significant that this same scholar represents a social type quite distinct from the one that represents the patron, who wears particularly lavish and luxurious outfits, whereas the scholar seems to be a bit more humble and dressed in a plain mantle and a simple cap. Joel's love for detail and also his profession as maker of manuscripts is apparent in the rendering of the book shown on the lectern. It lies open. The letters are graphically hinted by small strokes. The clearly visible lines of ruling and the red rubrics at the right of each line, as according to the Hebrew script, are strikingly realistic. The book is given a red binding whose claps are clearly discernible on the left. So this is clearly a bookmaker who has made this picture. The Haggadah describes the 3rd one, the simpleton, as a humble commoner who has no knowledge but is eager to understand. In social terms, he would be an honest but poorly educated member of the middle or lower classes. Jewish artists employed a variety of iconographic features to express these characteristics. He can be shown without a book or with a book with empty pages. Occasionally, he appears together with a person who is apparently attempting to teach him. The simpleton of the Washington Haggadah is the most intriguing of all and has actually no parallel. He's an elderly man with a facial expression distinctly conveying a lack of knowledge. His eyes are wide open and he stares into an open book. He wears a simple, somewhat worn hooded coat. Another example is found in the London Haggadah to your right, where he looks less miserable but simply dressed, eagerly looking into the book. Such figures of the 3rd son represent members of the Jewish society of whom we know significantly less than of wealthy patrons and the intellectual elite. They stand for what in the 14th and 15th century began to be defined as a mostly urban middle class. Craftsmen, merchants, and the like. They were upright and pious members of the Jewish communities who had acquired a trade but lacked religious learning. The mention of slavery and the building of the Egyptian treasure cities in the Haggadah opens up a window on a late medieval building site and its workers. This example is from the London Haggadah. But Joel would look even further aside at the margins of society. The son who does not know to ask appears in almost all of Joel's Haggadot as a jester. Fools and jesters were a regular part of medieval and early modern life. They figure prominently in the iconography of illuminated manuscripts and other visual arts. European monarchs employed jesters for entertainment at their courts. During the Middle Ages, these jokers wore bright, multicolored costumes with a hood extending into donkey's ears and a tail. They carried a long stick, a heavy clap, or a marotte, a short rod with a carved head. Some jesters were natural fools and simple comedians entertaining the folk. Others were smart, funny, and witty and eloquent outsiders employed to amuse the upper classes and members of the court. The borders between these types are not always entirely clear. Hunchbacks and dwarfs often filled the role of jesters, physically impaired, but often considered particularly witty and funny. This latter group was often ironic and critical and enjoyed some freedom of speech. Unconventional in their behavior, they were not part of any usual system of hierarchies and norms. The attitude of medieval society to the fool and the jester was somewhat ambivalent. He could be a sinner or an innocent. He could be believed to be close to the devil or close to God. In no way was he bound to conventions and norms. Representing immoral behavior and blasphemy, he also functioned as a critic of those who he was supposed to entertain. In the Jewish tradition, as well, questions about fools and unbalanced behavior have no clear-cut answers, and the definition of the line between normal and abnormal behavior is problematic. Christian society occasionally approached the fool as some kind of holy figure through whom God could speak, a notion that was alien to the Jewish tradition. Jesters were not found only at the court. Especially the natural fool as entertainer could be observed in all parts of society and appeared in the towns, at fairs, and at the markets. A sense of how the jester actually figured within the human landscape of Joel's surroundings can be obtained by looking at the Egyptian army in the London Haggadah. Here it is, and here is a detail. On the roof of the carriage at the right edge of the illustration appears a jester beating a drum and blowing a fife, both acts closely associated with the kind of entertainment a jester was supposed to provide. Early modern Italy also witnessed the earliest versions of the Purimspiel, a comic theatrical staging of the Book of Esther, involving various types and figures, including jesters. Joel's jester belongs rather to the type of the natural fool or the imbecile, whose unusual behavior may have been perceived as amusing, perceived as a person lacking wisdom and the ability to acquire knowledge. The popular figure of the jester could easily be employed as a prototype for this character of the fourth son. It is possible that Joel was actually the first artist to invent this iconography, which after 1450 became increasingly popular in Ashkenazi manuscripts of the Haggadah. Joel, of course, was aware of all the attributes attached to the foolish jester. He apparently knew that often the jester or the fool could be considered a blasphemous person of dubious morality, stupid and overly fond of himself. The hood with the donkey's ears, for example, is linked to this characterization. In a medieval German song, a donkey wished to appear in the disguise of a lion, but its large ears gave it away. Like the fool, the donkey represented blasphemy, lack of knowledge, and immoral conduct. Another common attribute was a mirror, a Spiegel, perhaps the root of the name of one of Germany's most popular jesters, Till Eulenspiegel. Overly fond of himself, the fool looks in the mirror, a mark of pride and blasphemy. In contrast, the witty court jester's association with the mirror was his function as a free-spoken critic. Obvious physical impairment in jesters symbolized as some sort of mirror the not so obviously seen intellectual impairment of the people of the court. The figure in the London Haggadah is not only a jester. He's also a vagabond with ragged, worn-out clothes. He also suffers from goiters, a disease that was closely linked to dwarfism and hunchbacks. Here, he has a big goiter. His expression with the grinning face, looking in the mirror, makes him appear particularly inept. Joel returns to the vagabond at several other occasions. The Haggadah text opens with the following words: "Here is the bread of distress, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let anyone who is hungry come and eat. Let anyone who wishes come and participate in the Passover. Today we are here, next year in the land of Israel. Today we are slaves, next year we shall be free men. Several figures in Joel's repertoire suggest that they are meant to represent those who are hungry, those who are invited to come and eat. In several of Joel's manuscripts, either the third or the fourth son is thus shown as a miserable, poorly dressed figure. In the Haggadah, again one of the early Italian haggadot, the simpleton wears a short, worn-out, and ragged costume, indicating, and the fact that it's a hooded costume indicates that he wanders around, that he may have no home. A similar figure with bare feet and a ragged hooded garment appears in both the Rothschild and the Washington Haggadah as the man who roasts the Passover lamb. In both images, he's seated on the ground, one hand turning to spit over the fire, no doubt a lengthy and tiresome procedure. In his other hand, he holds a cup of wine, while a bottle appears next to him ready to keep the cup refilled. In the Washington Haggadah, he appears next to the elegantly dressed women busying themselves with the preparation of the Passover meal. They peek somewhat arrogantly at his part of the composition, and perhaps, as the gesture of one of the women shows, offers some food. This ragged vagabond seems to represent the homeless and the hungry who is invited to the seder to come and eat, and was perhaps offered the thankless job of turning the spit with the lamb, or the piece of lamb for the seder itself. The lamb itself would be a reminiscent of the Passover sacrifice. Sometimes this vagabond is also physically impaired, suffering from goiters, clearly indicated at the area of the neck, and here you have them all. So why this special interest in the goiters as an iconographic element? The goiter is an enlargement of the thyroid gland, usually appearing as a heavy swelling of the neck. The enlargement is due to iodine deficiency in drinking water and salt, typical for alpine areas remote from the sea. The disease is thus specifically associated with alpine populations, and it remained as such until goiter prophylaxis was introduced in alpine areas in the 1920s by means of adding iodine to the drinking water and the salt in these regions. Goiters primarily affected several regions in Switzerland. There are Osterwelle in northern Italy, French Alps, Carinthia, Styria, Bavaria, and even some parts of the Apennines, such as Lombardy, Tuscany, and the Monti Sabini in southern Italy. Ancient and medieval physicians mentioned goiters and ways to treat the disease, and several of them were aware of its regionally determined appearance. To the north of the Alps, the goiters were often associated with monstrosity. They were in fact counted with the so-called fabulous monsters of the East. This perception remained popular until the early 16th century, when humanist chroniclers offered their own observations instead of reproducing earlier views about the monstrous races. In some late medieval sources, finally, the disease was understood as a punishment for sin. There was also a quite rich iconography of goiters in later medieval art, but only in those areas where the goiters were found. So Joel actually could look at quite a rich tradition of this. In line with the perception of the goiters as monsters, in southern German art, in the Upper Rhine region, for example, the goiters would often signify wickedness. The tortures of Jesus, for example, were occasionally shown that way. In Italy, on the other hand, to the south of the Alps, this was usually not the case. And here, where the goiters were extremely frequent in certain areas, it is a byproduct of early modern realism, often an iconographic sign to evoke empathy with the miserable and the sick. And this is a detail from a tapestry showing a worker, a hard worker, but certainly not a monster. And here we have a woman, this is a picture actually in the Metropolitan Museum, a woman of high rank from Bergamo, which was one of the places where goiters were especially very frequent. A certain difference in mentality can be observed in these approaches to the goiters. The wicked goiters of the North and the realistic Italian representations speak of different mindsets, and the latter seem to be linked to the humanistic worldview that began to govern European consciousness since the early 15th century. Joel Ben Simeon lived between these two different states of mind. He migrated between the two worlds. Joel Ben Simeon may have encountered people suffering from the goiters on the great St. Bernard when he moved to northern Italy, and also while living in Lombardy and Tuscany, but most likely not in the Middle Rhine region where he'd grown up. He may indeed have read or heard the view that goiters people are counted among the monsters, or at least that they had limited intelligence. He was certainly also familiar with the iconography. Joel's figures of the goiters are not evil, and they are not grotesque. They're poor and miserable, ignorant and perhaps stupid. Delineated as hungry vagabonds, they are quite likely to have been intended to represent those poor souls invited to partake in the seder meal. Joel most likely knew that the disease of the goiter was associated with stupidity. He did, however, not share the view of the goiters as wicked or monstrous. In short, these images demonstrate quite eloquently how Joel was nourished from the different cultures he lived in. The wickedness of the second son is defined by his alienness. The wicked one, and I'm quoting the Haggadah, the wicked one, what does he say? What does this right mean to you? To you, and not to him. And since he excludes himself from the community, he's been denied a fundamental belief. He has denied a fundamental belief. You should set his teeth on edge and say to him, it is because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt. For me, not for him. If he had been there, he would not have been redeemed. The wicked is thus understood as an apostate and is usually shown with iconographic characteristics of a non-Jew. Several haggadot show him as an overdressed dandy with a halberd, an imagery that perhaps has an Italian origin and was also adopted in the 15th century in some Ashkenazi haggadot, as here in the so-called Second Nuremberg Haggadah. Jewish costume was usually supposed to be simple and not in any particular way fashionable. Clothing restrictions arose both from the non-Jewish sumptuary laws and from Jewish halakha. The 15th century Ashkenazi scholar Israel ben Petachia Isserlein of Wiener Neustadt banned standified clothing, such as the colorful mi-parti costume, the one you see here, and pointed shoes, which this guy also wears, obviously. In 1404, the Cologne authorities in the Middle Rhine issued a law restricting the forms and fashions of Jewish clothing. What really marks these figures as non-Jews, however, is the halberd they carry. Joel Ben Simeon, however, as some other Ashkenazi haggadot, represents the wicked son as an armed knight. The characterization of the wicked as a knight emphasizes not only alienness, but also aggression. This is also what the dandy's halberd stands for. In some examples, the wicked son is shown in the act of attacking an unarmed victim. The wicked son represents a Gentile aggressor and is a symbol of anti-Jewish persecution. Until the 13th century, the Jews of Ashkenaz carried arms and even occasionally took part in the defense of their towns. The right to protect themselves was later restricted, and the royal protection of Jews, usually regulated in charters given to local authorities, permitting them to allow Jewish dwelling in their vicinities, was linked to the fact that the Jews were not supposed to carry weapons, and this begins in the 13th century. The Jews began to perceive themselves as unprotected victims and to associate the use of arms with Gentile aggression. The iconography of the knight emphasizes this perception of the non-Jew as aggressor. Joel Ben Simeon never chose to depict the dandy with the halberd, but always defined the wicked son as a knight, thus characterizing the wicked Gentile in unmistakable forms. Although he spent most of his working life in Italy, where Jewish-Christian relations differed from those in Germany, Joel seems to have carried on with a perception of non-Jews that grew out of his early days across the Alps. Similar knights appear in the crowded mass we have seen before of the Egyptian army, another symbol of anti-Jewish oppression and persecution. The hunting scene in the London Haggadah speaks a similar language. The hunting scene has, in fact, a twofold meaning. First, it is a verbal pun, referring to the abbreviation Yak Nehaz. A common Ashkenazi means to memorize the order of blessings at the beginning of the seder, in case the seder falls on a Saturday evening. The blessings are Yud, Yayin, Kuf, Kiddush, Nun, Ner for the Havdalah, Hey, the Havdalah itself, and Zayin, Hazman Hazeh. In the Jewish idiom, indebted to the Middle German, this abbreviation sounded like Jagd den Has, hunt the hare. The image would thus offer a memorization aid. By the 15th century, however, the hunter and his dogs had acquired a definitive anti-Christian meaning. Jews did not hunt, and most animals associated with hunting are non-kosher and unfit for consumption. In Jewish eyes, the sport of hunting was first of all associated with the nobility. More important, however, the doe mentioned in the Song of Songs was understood as an allegory of Israel, turning the hunting motive into an allegory of persecution, which later was also adapted to the hare, or attached to the hare. Last, but not least, near the text, go forth and learn, Joel Ben Simeon added the figure of a traveler, a verbal pun he may have invented himself, and we have seen it before. This motive appears extremely often in haggadot. All of the figures in Yoel's haggadot, this is perhaps the one, of all of the figures in Yoel's haggadot, this is perhaps the one with whom he most identified. Throughout most of his life, he was on the move. As a child, he first left Cologne. As a young man, he lived for some time in Bonn. Unlike other, especially Christian scribes and artists who maintained organized workshops at permanent locations, some of them establishing printing workshops during the second half of the 15th century, Joel practiced his profession at various places. Prior to his move to Italy, he may have worked along the Rhine Valley and perhaps also further to the east, in Swabia and Moravia. Even after coming to Italy, apparently did not live at any permanent location for long. His constant being on the road was not necessarily due only to fear of persecution, but rather with the way he chose to practice his craft. Joel reached Italy at some time between 1449 and 1452 when he signed a Mahzor in Gemona in Lombardy. In 1460, he crossed the Alps again. He apparently did not go back to the Middle Rhine, but remained in Ulm, where he joined forces with Meir Yaffe, a local scribe. In 1469, he's back in Italy at some unknown location and signed the mentioned prayer book for Maraviglia. He may also have taken part in the decoration of a Mahzor written during the 1470s by a scribe from Cesena in Emilia-Romagna. Down here, in 1476, he may have collaborated in the production of a halachic miscellany in Padua, in the Veneto, up there. 2 years later, in 1478, he was back in the German lands to produce the Washington Haggadah. In 1485, he perhaps can be followed to Modena, the Emilia-Romagna again. In that year, he wrote a copy of David Kimchi's commentary to the Psalter and noted in the colophon that he worked for a patron from that town. The year 1492 found Joel, an old man by now, in Tuscany, where he perhaps contributed to the decoration of a Mahzor in Florence, even though his contribution here is disputed. These places, stations in the life of a wandering scribe, are only those mentioned in the surviving colophons, but they give a fairly clear picture of the area he covered during his career. The small images of the young traveler who goes forth and learns may thus very well be associated with Joel himself in some sense, who, having left his native island, set out for Italy to develop there professionally and seek a well-to-do clientele. To conclude, a man of versatile skills, active in an age of great movement in the book trade, and moving between two cultures, Joel Ben Simeon must have seen quite a great deal. He was perhaps twice expelled from German towns, from Cologne in 1424 as a young child, and perhaps again from Bonn as a young man. He was still a young man when he set out for Italy. He must have had some sense of the tremendous changes German economic life underwent during those decades. An early 15th century native of the Rhineland, he belonged to a Jewish community which was persecuted in a region where the political and economic situation of the Jews had gradually deteriorated since the 12th century. When he emigrated to Italy, he certainly sensed a change of cultural atmosphere, got a taste of early modern humanism and changing artistic styles, and was able to witness dynamics of close Jewish-Christian relations to a degree that a German Jew would not have been able to witness. Joel began to build up his repertoire of Haggadah motifs early in his career while still in the German lands. Aware of the local tradition of Haggadah illustration, he developed a cycle of which, unfortunately, we have only a scant idea, as the margins of the two books from this period are so badly preserved. On his arrival in Italy, he saw early modern Italian art, echoes of which can be found in his subsequent work. Later, he introduced some of these more recent motifs in haggadot he made while temporarily working in Germany. The Washington Haggadah demonstrates this process beautifully. Drawn in the quiet, delicate figure style Joel had acquired during his early years in Italy and displaying several typical Italian motifs, it shows that in anticipation of an Ashkenazi parchment, he now focused on some typical Ashkenazi features, such as the image of Elijah, which we have seen already several times. A short remark about the role this potential owner played in Joel's work is in place here, and we have heard a bit already about it. The fact that the colophon in the Washington Haggadah does not mention a patron by name indicates that the book was not produced to order, but rather that this was intended to be sold on the free market. Now, this is a feature that is increasingly found in late medieval book trade. This seems to be a very minor detail, and you perhaps wonder why we stick to this and bring it up at all. But it is, as a matter of fact, very significant for what went on in the book trade during Joel's lifetime, and this gives us an idea about his professional identity. Whereas for the greater part of the Middle Ages, a wealthy patron, and this is a Christian manuscript from the 13th century, a royal commission, wealthy patrons would commonly order lavish manuscripts for their own use, and scribes and artists worked only on commission. The 14th and especially the 15th centuries witnessed significant economic and social developments that tremendously affected the book market, its clientele, and the way books were used. Book production began to change dramatically. The Southern German book trade played a prominent role in these developments, and there can be no doubt that Joel Ben Simeon was well aware of them. Far-reaching social shifts occurred during that period, and again, here's a Christian manuscript from that period just to demonstrate these changes. Far-reaching social shifts occurred during that period, when an ever-increasing wealthy middle class began to consume cultural goods that had hitherto been confined to the nobility. This educated, erudite, urban middle class grew into an influential clientele for the book trade, which in consequence underwent quite dramatic developments that would ultimately lead to the printing press. Decades before Johannes Gutenberg invented his press in 1455, the makers of books had already begun to adapt to the evolving situation, and among others to produce paper manuscripts of secular literature in the vernacular. This trend led to an entirely different approach to illustration and to the appearance of simple, quickly executed, only partly colored pen drawings, enabling the illustrators to work on greater numbers of copies. Another move towards accelerated book production was the appearance of the woodcut. One of the consequences in this development was the fact that books were no longer exclusively produced to order, but made in several copies for the open market and to be kept in stock. Like their Christian colleagues, Jewish scribes and illustrators were well aware of these possibilities. The colophon of the Washington Haggadah, which lacks the name of a patron, together with the nature of the marginal illustrations, exemplify these tendencies. Ben Simeon was thus indeed an all-rounder of the book production, a person who represented the trade in all its aspects. He copied books, he vocalized them, he made drawings, he painted them, he moved from place to place, he sought clientele in these ever-changing economic circumstances. A professional who still owned his training to manuscript tradition and who began to think in modern terms and took part in the changes that eventually would lead to the printing press. Thank you.